Okay, so I think it's pretty much live now. I don't really know how to start these kind of things, like start.
They're
It's
awful.
live. So,
Yeah.
um, so we are having a chat today, partly because I suppose before we'd had some interactions in the sense that like G plus kind of comments on posts and things. You left a comment on my actual blog, I think. Um,
Mm.
so mainly on around things that I'd written about presuppositionalism, and I'd seen you talking to some people in a different video explaining your views. So it's you're a kind of advocate of that Van Tillian presuppositional outlook or something. So I don't want
Yeah.
to put you down. Feel free to define how you want to define yourself. Is that fair?
That's totally fair. Yeah. When I was in college, I was very taken by idealist notions of ontology, and somehow I think that I sort of entered into the realm of Van Til at that point because he's such a critic of the idealists. Um,
So when you say
so
idealists, do you mean because that's a term that's bandied around quite a lot? Do you mean it in the sense of like Berkeley or Kant, or do you mean it in the sense of like post-Hegelian British idealists? I mean, what in particular were you drawn towards?
no, yeah, Berkeley is much more close. I was an immaterialist and a panentheist, or at least dabbling with those sorts of ideas for a long time in college, and really my Calvinism and my concepts of God's rationality being related to everything in the universe and making sense of everything in the universe sort of slowly got me to Van Til. And strangely, uh, in that route that I was going with all my thinking, I sort of lost a lot of the idealistic baggage along the way
Mm-hmm.
and became more traditional in my theism.
Okay, so I mean, did you find that like you got to a point where you were reading, and presumably you were reading philosophy, not just theology? Um,
Yeah.
and I mean, did you get to a point where you said, "Oh, I found a theory that's like the best fit with me, and I'm just going to stop"? Because, I mean, did you read Nietzsche? Did you read Sartre, Heidegger? Did you keep going? I mean, or did you just go, "Oh, Van Til, I like Van Til, that's me. I'm going to stop reading these other guys then"? I mean, because I've never really found a philosopher that's just like a fit. People say I'm a
Sure,
Van
sure.
Tillian or something. I never really identify with any philosophers. How did that work for you? Did you just thought he was right?
That's a great question. Yeah.
Oh,
No, as a very young uh, as a high school student and going into college, you have that there's that experience where you have these neat ideas that you're coming up with, and then you read philosophers, and you're like, well, this old guy from however many years ago came up with this in a way better format than I did.
mm-hmm.
Like, so there was a lot of that reading the idealists, but when I came along to Van Til, um, during that period of my life, because I was going to a Christian college, there was a lot of biblical uh, studies that I hadn't gotten in high school, and that I had been more in the philosophy side of things than in the theology side of things. And Van Til is to me like the ultimate um, middle ground between the two. He's where the two sort of overlap
Uh-huh.
for someone who's a Calvinist. And so when I saw his critiques of many of the things that I believed, I found them to be very persuasive because of a lot of the theology that I was trying to reconcile uh, with other convictions that I had. And I was just very rationalistic. I never, yeah, the beauties to me of a lot of the of Kant and a lot of the German idealists who come after that is sort of this questioning of our grounds behind reason, as opposed to just starting with pure theoretical thought. And Van Til, who's not even exactly unique for this, but Herman Duyeweerd and other colleagues of Van Til were big about this whole not starting without being self-conscious about where you're coming from. You know, what intellectual pre-commitments you're bringing to the table, and what culture and society you're surrounded by when you start to do your enterprise of philosophy or epistemology or whatever it is that you happen to be doing. And I saw that, and I realized that I was extremely rationalistic. I was extremely Cartesian. I was just a Cartesian foundationalist in so many of my my presuppositions, and I found them just to be, frankly, terrible. I didn't think that they were tenable at all.
Mm-hmm. So when you, it seems I can't imagine how you could critique a view without using your own reason. I mean, ultimately, if you say, "Oh, I used to be a Cartesian, and then I found it was unacceptable," that means that you critiqued it. You applied reason to it as a kind of tester, and there was some problem with it, and blah blah blah. So, the use of reason there is what you're doing, and isn't that exactly the thing that you're not allowed to do in the Calvinist perspective? You know, isn't that kind of sort of sinful to try and think about the world on your own 2 feet as if you were an autonomous reasoner? You know, aren't you being an autonomous, a sinful, bad autonomous reasoner there yourself by critiquing anything?
That's a good question. I don't think I think it's specifically it's different different theologians and philosophers have used different words to convey this idea. But like, for example, Jonathan Edwards was about the direction of your reasoning. Like, are you reasoning with respect to a desire, the end goal of which is always going to be the pleasure of God and being pleased with God? Or are you reasoning in a way that's, at the very least, not committed to that, you know, hesitant about that, or just finding the whole God idea to be superfluous to your whole enterprise of epistemology? So I don't think like me personally, and I don't think Van Til would have any issue with reasoning to critique something. I think if you're critiquing something without using your reasoning, you're not really critiquing something.
Yeah, right. I would agree.
Yeah, reasoning is indispensable. I would just say, reasoning is not a you know, I think reason is often reified as if it's like some kind of magical force that controls the universe, but it's just a process. You know, we're just using certain cognitive faculties that we have, and there's a right way to do it and a wrong way to do it. And for the Calvinist, part of what it means to use your reasoning correctly, or, you know, the science of correct inference, is doing it in a way that is in line with how God wants us to reason. So it already has God as part of the conceptual content of.
See, I don't understand. Does it just mean that, is it a tautology then to say something like that? Like, God wants you to reason in the right way, and the right way to do it is, you know, just not, you know, kind of not falling prey to some fallacies and thinking in circles and, you know, having no justifications or whatever. Does it just mean God likes good reasoning, or is it something like, I mean, because that seems like almost tautologist, and the way God wants you to reason and actually doing it properly is just the same thing, right? Is that what you mean?
Sure. Yeah, I think you can get into like meta ethics and you know, how to talk about the grounding for all these things, but just as far as just the conversation, yeah, just basically God doesn't want us to think fallaciously, basically. Yeah.
Because I mean, one way of saying it would be like, I mean, if it wasn't tautologist, then it might be that, because there's these in like medieval philosophy, there was I think it's Peter of Lombard. Anyway, someone who wrote down these things called the propositions, and then there was like big controversy over them because they were deemed to be heretical at some point, and they're basically Aristotelian principles.
Okay.
And so, like, I'm not really an expert in medieval philosophy, but one person I've looked at a little bit is William of Ockham, and I know about this because he got in trouble for writing a commentary on these propositions, and so he had to have he was summoned before a papal commission, basically, to investigate him, to see whether or not he was advocating sinful Aristotelian propositions, right? And so, this idea of like reasoning is according to how God wants you to reason, if it's not a tautology, might be that, there's some things that you're not allowed to think because God doesn't like you thinking like that. And then it's not a tautology to say that reasoning according to how God wants you to reason and reasoning well are the same thing, right? And it seems that in like the Enlightenment kind of idea, sort of, in some ways you can see it as like overcome. Well, it seems to me anyway, it's just kind of like an overcoming of the idea that there were these sort of forbidden areas prescribed by theology or something that you're not allowed to think about, not allowed to question or apply reason to. So it seems to me that reasoning at least the way that this kind of Calvinist idea, and again, I'm not really an expert on what Calvin said or whatever. I mean, the impression I get from it is that there's some kind of prescriptive, like you shouldn't go there, don't question that, essentially, and so reasoning according to God means not questioning these things, and that seems to me different from just using reasoning properly. It's a bit like free speech, right? If you have proper free speech, you can say anything you like. As soon as you start saying, you can't say this type of thing or that type of thing, right, then it's not really free speech again. And it's the same with using reason. If there's some things we're not allowed to question or kind of dare to interrogate, like these propositions, then it seems to me that's not using reasoning properly. But it might be using reasoning according to how God wants you to use it. So those two things might be different to each other. Do you see the distinction I'm trying to make?
Yeah. Sort of, I don't know, to draw on your analogy, I think it's more like, well, actually, let me jump back, because you use the word prescriptive, and that really lands on one of the major issues. Like for me, the ontology of logic involves that it is part of God's prescriptive law over humanity. So like I would deposit propositions about rules of inference in divine law, but for a lot of philosophers throughout history, that's just not an assumption in their system of logic, especially not Aristotle. That in the classical era, logic is practically, at least from my experience, logic is more like rules of the gentleman. If we're going to argue, if we're going to sit down and reason, then these are the rules that we're going to follow for the sake of being civil. It's almost like a contract. It's more like a contract, at least as I saw it in the likes of Aristotle. But not everybody thinks of it that way. And I think even though I'm not a Bonsonite, Bonson's big thing was sort of arguing from this categorical normativity and indispensable normativity of logic, that because naturalism can't make sense of categorical imperatives, logic is a categorical imperative. What are you going to do? Like, you can't reconcile those two things. That was Bonson's old argument. So I would, So I think you're right to see that for the Calvinist, I wouldn't say that there are things we can't reason about or question, like, why does God, if God is all powerful and all loving, why does God subject people to such painful experiences? I think it's a perfectly valid question. You read a couple Psalms and you come across deep, heartfelt questions like that. I don't think those are.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe the kind of prescriptive element can be framed a slightly different way. So maybe you're allowed to think about these things, but what you end up saying about them is prescriptive. So
sure,
you're not allowed to sort of. So I definitely get this impression reading Oliphant is that the idea that philosophy is handmaiden of theology, which is, it seems to me, a deeply misogynistic metaphor in the first place. But let's just move on from that. The idea there is that, like, yeah, sure, you can use philosophy, right, and which is basically just reasoning about things, about things like the nature of God or whatever, but it's really only to clear up what the doctrines are. So for instance, let's say we want to think about what the nature of the Trinity is or something. Sure, yeah, you can use philosophy there. It's kind of helpful, but as long as you don't at the end of the day, you have to affirm. It has to actually be true. Such and such doctrine. We're not trying to decide whether it's true. We're trying to decide how it's true. So there's a smaller field of potential conclusions that you should really be using reasoning to get to. So that again strikes me as a kind of restriction that's it goes against the spirit of reasoning in principle to say, sure, you can use, it's like saying you can have any color as you like as long as it's black. You can use reasoning as much as you like as long as you end up affirming the doctrine of the Trinity. That seems crazy. I should just affirm the conclusion.
I mean, I like black. So
yeah,
I like black. You're not going to get much sympathy from me for disagreeing about a black car.
Lucky for you, But if the point is that you should follow the conclusion that follows, not the one that you state in the beginning that you have to get to. It's like the difference between shooting an arrow or throwing a dart at a dartboard and seeing how close you get to the bullseye, and just throwing a dart at a wall and painting the bullseye around it so that you've got there. So there seems to be something kind of, if you just want to work backwards from the conclusion that you affirm, that's like not using reasoning properly. There's something kind of like broken down in the process there. You need to not be dogmatic about where you're going. And so that seems to me there's something like that going on with presuppositionalism that I can't. I find it fascinating, but I think sort of similar reasons that you were doing, because you as you said, Van Til's a kind of intersection of philosophy and theology. But it strikes me as not very plausible because, a bit like when you hear the ontological argument for the first time, there must be something, there's something fishy there, right? You can sort of smell that the argument doesn't work, but you can't quite put your finger on why. And unpacking why is really hard and involves all of these other independently interesting things. And I think that there's something like that going on with the transcendental argument. It seems to me that it's wrong, and I've tried to put my finger on what's going on that seems wrong about it. But I admit it's not a no-brainer. It seems to me there's some unpacking that needs to be done. But so maybe I could try, because you did tell me in a chat that I don't know how you put it, something like that, I'd beg the question by making the critique that I'd done. So this was in that blog post that I called The Problem with Tag. Did you remember? Do you remember that one? Okay, good.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So I think it's fair to say my argument was something like, I'd framed the transcendental argument as being a sort of modus ponens in a way, where it's like, let's see, so it's something like the Christian worldview is the necessary precondition for the intelligibility of, let's say, logic, but it doesn't really matter what we're talking about. And logic is intelligible, therefore the Christian worldview is the case. Something like that. That's basically the argument. And then it seemed to me that's like the way that it actually ends up being, like the claim is that only on Christianity does logic make sense, basically. So that sort of said a slightly different way means any other kind of worldview or outlook you take doesn't make sense, right? That's how you proving it by elimination. And that seems to me what's going on when people say the impossibility of the contrary. It's just like saying any other way of looking at it is impossible, therefore this way is true. It's a bit like a reductio argument. So I mean, what was I doing wrong according to you then when I said, so my point was, prove it. I don't see how you could prove that. How can you eliminate all of the other worldviews? It seems to me, right. And I can just construct one. A worldview then is one belief in it, and it can't be contradictory by definition because it only has one belief. It doesn't also have its own negation. So, have I not just proved then, trivially, that the claim every other worldview apart from Christianity is incoherent, is false?
Yeah, that is a critique which when I was getting into presuppositionalism, I had such a hard time with that objection for so long. That was quite a a brain twister for me. But again, I think the merit of Van Til's method of reasoning that really captured me was this almost intellectual humility, this ability to step outside of our thinking process and look back on it, not abandoning reason in the process, but just to look back at the own dialectic going on in our head and to say, wait a second, how did we get all these things? What's informing even just the nature of the connotations of the words we're using? All this stuff is none of this is purely original. So in the same way, when I look at the critique that you're giving, the problem that I have with it is the assumption underlying the critique that the tag is an argument by elimination is that there are many possible worldviews which could explain, or which could just be stipulated to explain logic, for example, to make sense of logic. And the problem I have with that is one or the other. Either it doesn't understand really what a worldview is, because a worldview isn't something that can just be stipulated. It has to be a genuine life commitment. It's the very thing that you use on a very psychological basis to even make sense of the reality that we're experiencing right now as we're talking to each other. Or it does understand that's what a worldview is. It's something basic to the very components of a person's psychology, but it's just saying pluralism, that there are many different perspectives of looking at the universe that are contradictory, but can still make sense of it. And I just don't find pluralism to be cogent. I don't think mutually exclusive worldviews can actually be. I don't think that situation can exist. I don't think that's possible to obtain.
There's a difference between saying pluralism being a kind of view like there's lots of different truths or something, right? And okay, even though my perspective is like fundamentally at odds with your perspective, they're both true or something. I'm not saying that. It seems to me that then it seems right anyway that, like, sure, there is a way things are, right? If that's an assumption I'm making, I'm guilty of saying that. Yeah, true. I do think there is a way things are. I don't think I know what it is, right? I mean, there's all sorts of barriers in between me and knowing how things are. Anyone who's read Kant would understand that you can't just say, I know how things are, at their fundamental ontological level. Obviously, you don't, right? But that doesn't mean that I'm committed to it not being the case that there's a way things are at the fundamental level. Might be really weird, but, probably is. See, reality seems to me is probably not pluralistic. But that's different. So, I mean, I'm happy to, at least for the sake of the argument, let's just set that aside, right? I don't think that anyone needs to be arguing for this kind of perspectivalism or pluralism, as you put it, if that's the view anyway. But that doesn't mean that there can't be coherent ways of looking at the world that are incompatible with each other, because coherence isn't the same thing as truth. I mean, so you can have somebody who's completely deluded about the way the world works, right? Who's hearing voices and seeing things or whatever, but it's coherent. I don't see why that it can't, a priori, what he's going through is incoherent. It could be coherent and just false. Or a film or something. Films aren't all incoherent. They're internally coherent, some of them. Not right. Most of them that have time travel in are not, it seems to me. But a normal, everyday, run-of-the-mill film can be coherent, doesn't have an internal contradiction involved in it, and yet the story it's depicting is false. So a worldview, I don't see why it's any different to that in principle. I mean, I have some fundamental commitments to the world. They're false, let's say, or at least one of them is false or something, but it doesn't follow. Or at least the claim seems to me that if any fundamental any worldview you have that holds a false principle somewhere along the line, results in it being incoherent.
Right.
Like that's the claim. Like, why is that the case? Because it's not the case with a novel, right? Is it? I mean, are you saying that's true with novels?
No, I wouldn't say that's.
Right. So yeah. Why is it true with worldviews but not novels?
Well. So, just speaking from my own perspective, my own philosophy, because the nature of truth um, is tied ontologically to God's plan for the universe, so that anytime you have a thought about, I don't know, let's say that I believe that my hair is a sparkling pink. um,
You're in black and white. So I assume
yeah, I'm in black.
that's an
It's not
example of
actually
a
pink.
false truth, a false
It's
proposition.
yeah. Let's say on the screen, the color portrayed by the screen, it's
Yeah.
sparkling pink as opposed to a black. Um, the problem is that ultimately there I am contradicting God, because God has planned the universe. God has set up the way that things are, and so if you set it up to be black, and I'm here thinking it's pink, I'm not comporting to the way that God is thinking. Now that's a rather I don't know. I would find that to be a pretty trivial issue. But the problem is that when we're talking about our first principles, our most basic intellectual commitments by which we start to do the enterprise of philosophy, like for example the reliability of our rational cognitive faculties, for example. Though because those are going to shape and color and give light to everything else that we're going to be talking about, if I contradict God on those grounds, then everything else in my system is going to be following that same suit. It's going to be following the same color that the palette of my first principles is giving me. If my first principles are all in contradiction with God, then everything that I build on top of them will inevitably not cohere with what he's saying. And since his plan just is the basis of coherence, coherence is ultimately accounted for by his all-encompassing plan that he has for the world. Anytime that my worldview at its fundamental level is contradicting him,
Okay.
it's not going to be coherent.
Let's just be clear then. So by coherence, there's two things that need to be kept apart, right? Otherwise, the argument is just equivocating. So the claim under investigation is that other worldviews are incoherent, right? So what does incoherent mean? Incoherent normally means that there's so a set is inconsistent. A set of propositions is inconsistent when it has a proposition and its direct negation, right? So I take incoherence to be something like that. So there's some contradiction involved. But the way you were talking about it just then is that incoherence just means not being like reflective of what God thinks, right? And that I could have a false worldview, and so it seems to me that reflecting what God wants you to think or how God thinks or something like that is just the same as saying. So when let's say, for instance, for the sake of clarity, I'll just adopt a kind of coherence view for the sake of it, right? So by true just means cohering with how things are, right? So if I say, this glass is empty, it's false. Sorry, if I say this glass is full, it's false because the glass is empty. It's not full, right? And so that's why it's false. And then you're going to say, well, I have a very similar notion, right? That if I was to say that the glass is full, by that I mean it doesn't cohere with, I don't know, the way God's plan is, or sort of however you said it. But it seems to me it's basically just correspondence to the way things either are or how God wants them to be. So it's basically the same notion. So yeah, okay, sure. If you have a false belief, then, and as you said, anything that builds on it is going to keep that falsity. It doesn't. Okay, fine. So if everything else I think is true, apart from this one thing which I think is false, then as a whole, I don't have the correct way of looking at things because at least one thing I think is false. That's true, but that doesn't mean that what I'm thinking is incoherent or inconsistent, right? Because my belief that this is empty doesn't necessarily contradict anything else that I think. So I have, it seems to me, a false view of the world, but a coherent one. Or at least it doesn't. Just saying that this is false doesn't show that it's incoherent, unless you're just going to say, by incoherent, I just mean not being what God wants me to think. And that makes me think, well, you're just saying that incoherent just means not true. Okay, well, that just so. But you agreed with the starting point. That incoherence means having an internal contradiction. So I'm waiting to hear why. I'm still waiting for this argument. Right? What is it that makes a worldview that doesn't start with God have a contradiction in it, if that's the claim?
Right. That's a fantastic point. So no, I wouldn't claim that that coherence can be made sense of as something that is contradicting God, but also isn't what we normally mean when we say coherence. Now, what I'm just trying to point out is that from my philosophy, the reason that incoherence will pop up in any worldview that doesn't take the revelation of God as its first principle, as its starting point, its most basic level of intellectual commitment, is because God's revelation just is the communication of God's plan for humankind and the universe. And if it's like trying to make sense of a map without the key. Revelation is the key to the map. You can't start looking at the map and try to make sense of it without that key. So any worldview that comes to the map and says, I'm going to start relating these geographical objects to each other, it just has no place to start. It's just going to be making claims out into the dark there. It's inevitable that incoherence will arise. But to jump back really quick to what you used a fantastic analogy before about stories, about fictitious writing, and how they're coherent, but they're not factual, and I completely agree with that. But what I would say is, it just is, I think, your different philosophy on the nature of truth, your different commitments on the nature of truth, that coherence and correspondence aren't interlinked, so that one can have a worldview that's coherent but not necessarily factual, whereas I would say no. I think coherence is linked to God's revelation in such a way that if you don't have if you don't have access to the one who's grounding the very nature of coherence, then you wouldn't have any way to have a coherent worldview at all. So I think that would just be our two different perspectives or theories about the nature of truth.
I'm really not. So there's a coherence theory of truth, right, where you just say, look, truth just is coherence or something. So, like, are you taking that view? Is it? I mean, which assumption are you disagreeing with me on? I mean,
so what I would disagree with you on is I don't think that a worldview can be. I don't think somebody can be coherent
and false at the same time.
Yeah.
Okay, so that because truth is coherence, is that why?
No, so I think somebody can be. That's why I made the analogy about trivial things. I think somebody can be false about trivial things. I don't think somebody can be false about their basic worldview commitments and also have coherence, because coherence is the thing that's supposed to be. Because I believe coherence is the thing that is supposed to be delivered by your basic intellectual commitments. Your entire
what does coherence mean, and what do you mean by coherence? Because I gave an explanation for it, which is like, it's formal consistency, right?
Sure.
I can talk about my beliefs as just being a kind of list of propositions, and coherence just means that they don't contradict one another, right? If that's what you mean, I don't see what that has to do with my kind of metaphysics or anything. Like, I could be a solipsist and still have that view. I could be a Christian fundamentalist and have that view. How is that linked to metaphysics? Right?
Because it's my metaphysics implies the negation of that, right? Like, because of my perspective about the nature of truth, that facts about the universe are things that God has created. He's set up a world where every fact is made sense of in light of His plan. When you start having beliefs about the world, and you start having basic intellectual commitments about the world that allow you to start building a system to think about the world, if you don't have that system grounded in God's framework, then it's inherently detached from the very thing that coheres all facts in the universe. It's detached from the very thing that accounts for the coherence of all facts and reality. So again, it's like it's coming to the map without the key.
So
And you need the key to have coherence.
When I said that consistency, so I'm assuming, like, stop me where this goes wrong. Consistency is essentially the same thing as coherence.
Yes.
Okay, good. So why can't I define consistency as I did, like a logic textbook would do? Because you're saying that, oh, you can't define it unless you have this reference to God in that equation. Well, but why? I mean, I mean, pick a logic textbook up, have a look. They do that.
Sure.
It's a formal notion, it seems to me.
So that I would agree. That would be my argument. But just at this point, all I'm saying is that's my belief. My point of view is I don't think.
Oh wait, sorry. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. But so let me just get this clear. Then that the belief isn't that. So the belief is that coherence is undefinable without relation to God. Like, that's the belief. Is that what you're saying? The belief about the definition of coherence. Is that the idea?
I'm not sure I would say it's undefinable without like explicit reference to God, or that's kind of hard to. To what degree does God need to be referenced in definitions? I don't know, but
right. Sorry, carry on. I interrupted you. So sorry, carry on. What were you?
No, that's fine. No, that's fine. Please do. But what I would say is I think implicit in the assumptions that one has to make about logic is the revelation of the Christian God. Obviously his existence and providence, but specifically the revelation of the Christian God. That is my point of view. So when you were talking before about the novel, I'm not exactly making an argument yet. All I'm saying is I think it's important to get out on the table then that when you're critiquing when you brought up with Butler what was his comment? Something about the basketball player.
Yeah.
He's the best basketball player.
That's Banson's analogy.
Yeah, I thought that was a terrible analogy. I couldn't believe that came out of Banson. But
so just in case there's someone watching who doesn't know what I'm talking about, right? So the idea is that like the Christian worldview is like Michael Jordan, in the sense that like he beats everyone in one-on-one basketball games or whatever, and then someone comes along and the spiteful, I don't know, atheist guy or whatever says, oh, but there might be another player who can be better than you, so you can't say you're the best player. And then the response is, bring it on or something, right? But like, okay, even if that's right, I mean, basically in sports, that is how you figure out who's the best player. You have the #1 ranking. Like in tennis, I think Andy Murray has the #1 ranking at the moment. He's the best player, even though, I mean, there might be some guy, I don't know, in China who physiologically would be better at tennis if only he played, but he's got to work in a factory 20 hours a day or something, right? Like, that doesn't invalidate the claim that Andy Murray's the best. He is the #1 tennis player because that's how it's figured out. But when you're coming to, like, you can't say that the Christian worldview, because the apologist puts the argument forwards, beats everyone that he like engages with, that means that's not a reason to think that what he's saying is true. You could win every debate and still have a false thesis, right? So that's the argument. And so you agree that that's a terrible. That's
a terrible response.
Right.
Not necessarily because I think. Well, I'm sorry. I don't know if you finished there.
No, I had finished. Yeah.
Okay. Not necessarily because I think Banson's perspective was wrong, but he set himself up badly when he tried to use an inductive analogy, because he's trying to say something that's not inductively founded. That's something that is innate, something that can't be. It's indispensable. It's preconditional. So his analogy was just, I thought, very poor. What the issue is, I think, is that the atheist who's coming up and saying, yeah, well, this other person come along, that just is another worldview. So if that worldview isn't in and of itself of demonstrating the very claim that's there, somebody else could come along, then the challenge itself falls apart. And I don't think, again, that claim, somebody else can come along, makes sense, because the very purpose of a worldview, the very place that a worldview plays in our lives, is to make sense of the world. Not to say, I can't make sense of the world, but maybe somebody else could. That's just, that just is to give up making sense of the world. Or I could try to interpret it as a pluralistic statement that, maybe I can't make sense of the world, but that doesn't mean there can be multiple views that make sense of the world. But I don't think I think I was correct there in predicting that I don't think you're a pluralist. I don't think you would find that a satisfying interpretation of your critique to just say, oh, this is Alex is just being a pluralist. Like, I don't think that's what you were doing. But I think those are the only ways that I can make sense of that accusation of disproof by elimination. That just is itself an interpretation of tag based on the commitment that, even if I can't make sense of the world, somebody else can. Well, that's not a cogent commitment. That's not a commitment that's rational. But since that's what's the word? Because that is part and parcel to your critique, I don't really see any way of overcoming that.
So from my point of view, you think there's no way of me overcoming that because I'm not really clear what's going on that you see as the issue. So, and I think this has to do with the nature of what you think a worldview means. So, like, maybe you can just spell something out about, like, what. So, okay, here's a question then. Is a worldview just a list of beliefs that an agent has?
No, not necessarily. I think we can talk about a worldview that way, but I think I would say that it's like a metonym for what a worldview actually is. Like a worldview is one's one's basic beliefs, one's fundamentals, one's ultimate intellectual commitments that make sense of all the other beliefs. Sort of the root of the tree.
How is a belief to be distinguished on the basis of its ultimateness? Like, I have a belief that there's beer in my glass because I filled it up. I don't have a belief that the Earth is flat. I suppose I have a belief that the Earth is sort of more or less spherical. Is that more a fundamental belief than my belief that there's beer in the glass? Is it a scale? Is it like this? Or is it just every belief is trivial apart from like 3 beliefs I have or something? I mean, like, I need more detail with this. I'm not clear what... It seems to me like the idea is that fundamentality is just a given. Everybody knows what that means. I'm not sure what that's doing in this. I have a load of beliefs. That's the starting point, right? Now clear up for me how I categorize them in terms of fundamentality.
Sure. Well, I don't think that you, presumably a place to start would be, I don't think you treat the shape of the Earth as something that's indispensable to your worldview, right? That's something that, were there enough evidence, you would be willing to do away with it, or even if if you were having a conversation with like a solipsist, you might be willing to put it aside for the sake of argument, just to argue with him about. But I don't think everything is that way, right? There are certain things that you would say are indispensable to your, to any point of view that you just can't get away from and that you can't do without.
Maybe, but it seems weird to say that. I mean, now we seem to be back at the beginning where, like, if I'm doing philosophy, it would seem weird to just say, like, it seems like we're back at that Oliphant thing where you just go, well, we can use reason, but only so long as it doesn't question these things, right? And that's what you're saying here is that, like, I have a list of things where I'm willing to say, I'll reason with you, but I'm not willing to give these things up. I don't know, maybe I have those things, but I don't feel like I do. And I would feel like a bad philosopher if I just said, oh, I'm just never going to disbelieve this thing. Have you read Quine before?
Yeah, not much of him, but just
right. But
comments here and there.
The idea with that is supposed to be that sure, there are things that you could, or Wittgenstein, read On Certainty by Wittgenstein. He has this metaphor of it being like, the belief structures are like the stream or something. There's like, the top bit of the stream which changes quite often, and then there's like these kind of deeper currents that sort of change but slowly and over time, and then there's these kind of rocks at the bottom which really takes a big current or something to move them at all. Most of the time they stay still, but there's nothing that in principle couldn't move, and Quine likes that idea. And has so you could, I mean, you could in principle think about the laws of logic being revised or something. It would take a lot, right? It's not that you could just think it. You'd have to really it would take a great deal of effort or something, really strong evidence, something like that. But yeah, why not? I've read Graham Priest, so I thought non-contradiction seems pretty damn fundamental. But yeah, okay, it's not incoherent. Well, I mean, you sort of, coherence isn't really a notion you can hold on to anymore once you go into that. But it's not obviously nonsense once you start saying that there may be some things that are both true and false, like the liar sentence, for instance. I mean, no one really has any good idea of how to treat that. So it's, it could be both true and false. So you're telling me that I have certain, well, I mean, it seems to me if I have a worldview, I mean, I'm sure you're going to say that everybody has a worldview, right? And then you're saying that part of a worldview is that you have these beliefs that you're not willing to give up. I don't feel like that's true for me.
Well, wouldn't you say, as a philosopher, that you believe that you're capable of doing your job pretty well, and I think you do your job pretty well, but that you're capable of doing your job pretty well without invoking this concept of God or his revelation or whatever, stuff like that?
But I don't know that. I mean, maybe he's pulling the strings in the background. I don't know. Maybe he is. I'm certainly not fundamentally committed to a belief that I can do this without God. I might be only doing it because of God. That might be true. I'm not committed to that not being true. It seems to me that you're committed to it being true. I think I'm not committed to it being false, which makes us different, because I'm not religious and you are. And it seems to me that being religious means having certain things that you won't let go of. And not being religious just means that you don't have those things. That's how I think about it. If I was to classify as an atheist, it's not because I'm committed to there not being a God. It's just because I'm not committed to there being a God. So as a stupid, long waste of time debate about whether that counts as atheism, I don't care if it does or it doesn't. That's my view anyway, right?
Sure.
So I almost have no belief, it seems to me, where this degree of belief is one. Right? So does that mean I don't have a worldview then, according to your definition?
Well, I mean, maybe, but maybe for the sake of conversation, maybe. But what I would say is, I think this draws back onto the conversation we were having in the little box there, the I am chat, where I was accusing you of begging the question there, because the problem is, if you're going to say that you're not committed to the Christian God, then it just follows by definition you're committed to his superfluousness, to your system. Like,
no, that's a really blatant logical fallacy, right? That's, I mean, so if I said to you, let's say I've got a box, right, and you don't know what's in it, and I say, do you think there's a red apple in the box? Sorry, let's just make this as clear as possible. So I say there's this box, right, and you don't know what's in it. But I say there's an apple in it. Do you think the apple is green? You're going to say, well, I don't know if it's green or not, right? I'm not going to say, aha, you're committed to the not being green. You're not committed to it not being green just because you're not committed to it being green. You don't know whether it's green or not, right? You can't. I wouldn't force you into a position that said you're committed to it being a non-green apple. You just don't know what color the apple is. Right? How is that different?
Well, I would agree with you there, but I think the distinction there is, I would be committed to the superfluity of the apple to my system, right? The only way that I can say I don't know whether the apple is green or red is if my knowledge of that apple being green or red does not depend, is not a precondition for the rest of my life, intellectual thinking, knowledge, so on and so forth, right? It would have to be superfluous to my existence, basically.
Well, all right. If I told you the color of the apple is a precondition of your being able to tell what color the apple was. With that, so then I can make that move, and then I can force you into being committed one way or the other as to whether it's green. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Then I would have to ask you about whether the what are we talking about here when we're talking about the apple being green or red and its preconditionality to system. I don't think it's pretty
okay, here we go then. So if the apple is green, right, and if the apple wasn't green, you wouldn't be able to make sense of anything. That's my claim, right? So you don't think the apple's green because you don't know what color it is, and therefore you are committed to it not being green, right? And that's the argument I'm making. How would you respond to that?
Well, I don't think that's a. Do you want me to respond to the argument, or do you want me to?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, so to the argument, I don't think it follows that because I don't think it's one. I would say I'm committed to it being superfluous to my system, but I don't think I'm committed to.
No, but I'm saying that it isn't. And my claim, my first premise is that it's not superfluous.
That it's preconditional.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that would be what I would ask you about. Like, what is the nature of this apple, right?
Well, you couldn't make sense of what color it was unless you believed it was green. That's my argument.
Okay. When we talk about it being an apple, does it mean the same thing when I talk about another apple? Like, can I hold it in my hand? Is it empirically?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, then I would say that it's not preconditional because
so being able to hold it in your hand makes it not. How does that follow?
Because it would be limited to time and space. And if something's limited to time and space, then it cannot act as, it does. In other words, it has properties that are incompatible with something that would have to, whatever would be preconditional to my system would have to have certain properties, and it couldn't have other properties. Like, for example, it couldn't have properties of, I don't know, it couldn't have the property of being something that could die, for example. It couldn't be a biological substance that could fall apart, because then the very things.
Sorry, carry on.
Go ahead. You look like you really wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, like, it seems a really obvious move I can make at this point, which is to just say that's because you already don't believe, like, obviously it doesn't make sense to you because it is the precondition for you making sense of anything, and because you don't believe it's true, it seems to you like for things to be preconditions, they have to be non-spatiotemporal. But once you accept that it is a precondition, you understand how things don't have to be non-spatiotemporal. There can be a contingent spatiotemporal object which happens to be the precondition for intelligibility. But you have to believe that it is in order to understand that that's true. And if you don't believe that it is, then obviously nothing you think makes sense, right? Obviously it doesn't make sense to you because you don't already think that it's true, right? So, I mean, that's the obvious move. And
Sure.
Then you'd say, well, you're begging the question, right?
Well, I would just say that I don't think that that's a. I think that that's an interesting point of view, but I would want to know. The two things I would want to know is what the story is. What the metaphysical narrative is as to how an apple gets its way of accounting for the rest of the world.
Right. Okay. So look, but let me just come clean. So, like, the purpose of the analogy is to show that, like, when you're appealing to these sort of meta principles about, like, oh, it has to be non-spatiotemporal, blah, 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 you're assuming that those things are independent from the worldview because that's a measuring stick that you're using to show what could be a precondition of intelligibility. But if the point is that if it's a precondition of intelligibility, it really is a precondition of intelligibility. Like, you have failed to step out of your worldview or whatever because you're assuming there's this thing like, something couldn't be a precondition of intelligibility unless it filled this, like, checklist of properties that I've got. And I could say that that's something that's just your worldview, right? Which is doesn't make sense because you don't believe that the apple is green, and right. So, like, if so, it's kind of similar to if I said to you, look, there could be a contradiction, and you go, no, there couldn't be because the law of non-contradiction is true or something. Then we get into this point where, like, is that a measuring stick that you can use? I mean, I'm essentially calling that the idea of that having any kind of normative force into question. You can't appeal to it as the thing that forbids me doing that.
Right.
So if I'm being truly presuppositional about the apple, you can't really appeal to anything like an independent standard of like what counts as a something that could be a precondition of intelligibility without presupposing that you've got an independent thing that I agree with. So whatever you say, I can just say, well, that's what someone who doesn't believe the apple is green would say. And then it just seems like this whole thing, that seems to me a perfect analogy for presuppositionalism. I mean, like, you just don't want to like play the game on the same rules as everybody else. You just want to say, well, unless you start here, it doesn't make sense. And if I say why, you say, like, call my ability to reason into question because I haven't started where you've started. Right? So do you see what I'm doing?
I think I understand I think I understand your point. Just to sort of give it, I don't think you had to, just for anybody watching who wants to accuse you of silliness for the green apple analogy, I don't think that's a silly analogy, because you could talk about Hindus who don't, traditional Hinduism doesn't believe in a binary system of thinking, right? There's all is Brahman. So it's a perfect example of someone who's actually committed against Western laws of inference. So yeah, that I think that happens. But I would agree to what you said. What I would want to point out is, okay, for anyone who says, wait a second, on my worldview, things being empirical or things being capable of death or this or that property or whatever is not something that's not a something you can appeal to as a problem for my system because it presupposes this this meta standard. What I would say to that is, okay, well then this meta standard that I'm using, that's fine. I don't want to impose things on your worldview. Like if I was arguing with a Hindu, I wouldn't want to make appeals to Western concepts of thought. I would want to appeal to more religious concepts that I think the Hindu would find more appealing. With you, I think logic is I don't know. I think me and you are much more grounded in a Western society.
Yeah, I know nothing about Hinduism, basically.
Okay. Okay.
Yes.
Well, sure. Okay. Well, to make a long story short, I agree with you that it would be problematic if I were running around, applying meta rules to people. But I think that's actually a fair criticism if I were doing that. I don't think that my system forces me to do that. I want to critique people on their own ground. All I would say is, in the critiques that I see that you're giving of presuppositionalism, there is this commitment that God is not the concept that you use to make sense of the world. We can have these conversations. You can critique presuppositionalism, for example. These things are all possible and make sense, but we don't need God to do it. And that's where I would just say, why? How do you make sense without God? How does the world function without reference to speaking? And if you think that I am that the being, this concept of a being I refer to is silly, like, I welcome conceptual analysis. I'll hand over definitions of the God I'm talking about. Like I'm a strong believer in biblical theology, so I'll run through metaphysical stories of how I think he accounts for things. It's not like I'm trying to play a card of mystery here, where I have this mystery God that I'm not willing to tell you anything about, until you actually agree to believing in him. Like I'm not trying to trick anyone here. Sorry, I know that's a lot to. I'm not trying to snowball the conversation.
I'm not as interested as in the like cut and thrust of the worldview game. Right? I'm not going to trade naturalists' explanation of whatever for your Christian whatever, partly because I just see that as a never-ending trench warfare of just coming up with things to say. and it seems like a misunderstanding of like what conceptual analysis is. Anyway, I'm not going to win a war with you. But secondly, I don't really have any. I'm not really on anyone's side with that. So I don't really care so much whose worldview is better, because I'm not convinced that by your definition I have a worldview. So it seems like somebody else's fight, not mine. So in a sense, I'm not that interested in what your particular system of beliefs is. What I'm interested in is the claim that, well, it seems to me that your claim that only your system could be right and everyone else's system has to be false doesn't depend in any way on what you believe. Like, we haven't talked about it. It doesn't make any. It's just a claim X is the only claim if every other claim that's not claim X is incoherent. That's the idea, and it doesn't matter what claim X is as long as it's coherent and every other claim isn't. So you could believe that God is a trinity or quad or whatever. It doesn't make any difference, right? As long as it's coherent and everyone else isn't, that you just win by default. Whatever crazy weird thing happens to be the only coherent way of thinking about things, just I have to go with that. Like that seems to be the force of your argument. So I'm really not really so interested in what precise details of what you believe. It doesn't really seem to make any difference. Like, you don't get to win because of some subtlety in your metaphysics. You get to win because all the other views are incoherent. That's the claim, right?
Right.
And I still don't see why. I mean,
yeah, I would.
Do I just fall between the cracks because I don't count as a player in the game because I'm not committing to a particular thing? Is that why I don't? Like, is that right? So let's just clear this up then. So by worldview, you mean some set of beliefs that you would never give up, right?
Well, that I would say that you believe they're indispensable. Yeah, I would say there's the things that you think.
Wait. That's a belief about beliefs. I could believe that my belief that, I don't know, non-contradiction is true. I could believe that me believing it is indispensable, and then find out that it isn't indispensable. Like the way that geometers used to think that Euclidean geometry was indispensable, but then they realized that that belief was false and it wasn't indispensable. But you're not saying that I have second-order beliefs about beliefs, right? Second-order beliefs saying the content of belief X is indispensable. You're saying belief X is indispensable. I won't give it up. Not that I think it's indispensable. Those are different things, right?
Well, I think you can. I'm not trying to be pedantic here. Part of it depends on how we define belief, right? Like, you can just supposing that belief has to be something that's conscious, right? You can end up treating certain propositions as indispensable, even if you don't have second order conscious. I'm actually thinking about it at the forefront of my mind right now. Beliefs that it is indispensable, right? So what I would say is, like, whatever someone is treating as indispensable, whatever someone is invoking as the way to account for reality, and that, again, that's a very I readily admit that's a very broad term. What exactly is entailed in accounting for reality? But I think that's sort of the point of it being a worldview, is that it's the broadest thing that you can talk about. It's the whatever is part and parcel, whatever is whatever is ineradicable to your belief set, whatever's behind all of them, making sense of all of them.
But take my mum, right? My mum's never read any Nietzsche or Kant or anyone like that. She doesn't have any particular metaphysics in mind, I'm sure. Right? She doesn't have any particular epistemology in mind either.
Sure.
So does my mum have a worldview?
Sure. Yeah, I would say.
Why? Why do you think that she does? Well, what is it about everybody that? I mean, so it seems to me there's this, like, you're just saying a priori, axiomatically, everyone has a kind of like a first principle that organizes everything, like the old ancient Greek philosophers would do when they say everything is fire or whatever, and then they're supposed to sort of
Right.
Spinoza or something, everything's quite axiomatically laid out. But it just seems that's just empirically not true for like most people. You only really particular types of philosophers ever have that view. And then you get people like Nietzsche who explicitly rejects that idea, system builders or whatever. And then you just get like people who aren't philosophers who don't think about anything like that. And it seems to me that the only people who would think that are the people who are in their first, experience of philosophy, who have. I read Nietzsche yesterday, so I think everything Nietzsche said is true. And then I read Heidegger today, and now I think Nietzsche's wrong because what Heidegger said is true. And they adopt a worldview because they just believe whoever the last person they read said. Right? That's an experience that everyone who goes through philosophy has. But once you read enough of it, you start to realize, hold on a minute, everyone says everyone else apart from them is wrong, right? So like I stopped just trusting that, I stopped just adopting them, right? I don't just have I like things about rules, I like things about Peter Singer, even though, if I don't adopt either of those views because like they contradict one another in different places, right? I even see somehow that some parts of Nozick sort of make sense. But I call it seems to me, once you're an independent grown-up person, you call it as you see it. You don't just lean on someone else and say, I am Hobbesian or I'm a Lockean or something like that. You know what you like about Hobbes and what you like about Locke, and you put them together if you want to, or you just say, shit, this is just complicated. I don't know, I don't like everything about what Hobbes says about freedom. I don't like everything Spinoza says about it, but at the end of the day, I don't know who to go with. Like, I just keep my mind open, right? Like, and most things, it seems to me, are really complicated in philosophy, like metaphysics or epistemology. So I don't just go around with like a big world. I don't have like a picture in mind. I mean, I think isn't it just that you can't imagine what it would be like to not have a picture in mind because you've got a picture in mind? I mean, is that all this is? It's just that you think everyone's got a worldview because you've got a worldview.
I hope not.
Is it not a presupposition of yours that I have a worldview?
Is it a presupposition? That's a good question. I suppose just because of the fact that I think, yeah, I guess so. Yeah, because I don't really see a way of looking at human beings as not acting in a way that betrays or communicates some kind of principle that their life revolves around, right? So to jump here and with theological language, for example, the Christian, especially a very Reformed perspective, a covenantal perspective, is that human beings are created with a sort of worshiping instinct. It's just in our nature to worship something and to make something the God of our lives. And that, for someone who believes it, has a huge impact on the way that we interpret philosophy and what you were talking about with the classics, right? The principles that they're building their whole system on. What I would say about like your mother or even me before I ever got into philosophy or anyone else is I would just say, I don't think that they have to be conscious. I think they can be totally subconscious. That's why these things are so, that's why philosophy is so important. That's why the world of intellectuals is so important, because ideas have effects on people, even if they're not aware of them, right? Like we live in a Western society that has been shaped by Kant's gap between the noumenal and the phenomenal. Whether the person down the road has any idea who Kant is, I'm sorry, it's just a matter of culture. It's just a matter of where you've grown up and your genes and everything that makes you you, that you're going to end up thinking of the world that way, because that's the world that Kant has helped shape with his ideas. I don't think there's any way around that. That to me is sort of the biggest merit of that Van Til and colleagues of his like Dooyeweerd ever gave philosophy is, hey, we have to be very careful because we need to be very self-conscious about what sort of things we're committing ourselves to that we don't even realize, or that we're not paying attention to, or that we're not seeing how they play out in our lives.
Yeah, okay, but so I would think I would agree with that. But that you shouldn't take that too far. I mean, that's true for those things that we are committing ourselves to, but that doesn't entail that there are things that I'm committing myself to, right? If I'm someone, so take someone who's like got an implicit but unconscious bias, so they don't think that they're sexist, but when it comes to like job interviews, they always pick the bloke. If you ask them, why did you do that? They say, oh, it's just better qualified. And after a while, you're going to say, dude, you've got like an implicit like bias against women when it comes to hiring. And that's the sort of thing that happens in the real world every day, right? You can find that they do have an implicit bias because like it manifests itself in some way. Okay, so if we're saying that, I mean, I can't imagine how a view about Kant's transcendental idealism is somehow supposed to be there in, say, my mum's mind when she doesn't know anything about it. Like, I mean, are you saying that if you were to interrogate her about, the noumenal realm, to give her all the definitions, that she would end up in finding Kant's view intuitive? I mean, how does it manifest itself? Or is it just a claim? Because once you just start saying, look, I don't think it manifests itself at all, but she just has to have a view one way or the other about Kant's transcendental idealism. It just seems like wildly implausible. And the kind of nice thing you just said about Van Til, which is like, when people have implicit biases in philosophy, they should become aware of them. That's true, of course, just as it's true for the guy who's hiring people. But that doesn't mean that everyone who's hiring people is either, has an implicit bias. A lot of people just like either aren't sexist purely for no reason. They just don't feel one way or the other that, you should do that. Some people like have read books about implicit bias and have thought about it themselves and realized I shouldn't be like that. It's an unconscious thing. Like, I don't want to discriminate, but because of the culture I was brought up in, I kind of do. So I'm gonna make sure I evaluate these people the same way. Like, you can overcome those without, Van Til's insight is nice, but it doesn't seem to be that profound. I mean, don't philosophers do that? Isn't it just a bad philosopher that doesn't do that? I mean, I could quote you bits of Wittgenstein where he says almost the same thing. It doesn't seem a particularly novel insight. Yeah, and I agree that it's right as a kind of methodological practice, but I don't think that it entails anything about any given person.
Sure. Well, just to, because I think that is a fair point. Like, how the hell is Kant's transcendental idealism popping up in your mother's? That's a pretty weird statement. How is Hinduism, coming up in the schoolboy that I met when I was 7 years old? Well, what the heck is that? What I would say is, I think it comes up in the. I don't think it necessarily comes up as beliefs. Like, I don't think anyone necessarily agrees or finds Kant's system inherently intuitive. What I would say is that I think Kant has shaped at least the Western world's language game, so that when we start to talk about anything that's intellectual, there tends to be this concept of the thing in itself versus my perspective about the thing. And that is hugely affected. It's affected Europe more than it's even affected Americas. And I don't pretend to have any much of an education about the cultural manifestations over here versus over there. But that one little factor I noticed that, like, yeah, you guys are much more aware of, for example, like the distinction between the state and religion. That's not half as much a problem over there as it is over here. And I think philosophers have and other intellectuals have a lot to do with those sorts of events in life. The very way or method or language game that we play in talking about those things is very much affected by them. Even if we don't agree with their system, we're still borrowing There are
Yeah.
ways of
Okay.
doing
Okay.
things.
Okay. So look, but there's this is kind of like, yes, I agree. There are trends in philosophy, and like when you come into stuff, you're you're coming to it with some like background of like context and stuff, right? Yeah, of course.
Mm.
Yes, I have certain beliefs, and I bring them into this conversation beforehand. Of course, I do, right? And you know, yeah, yes, contemporary philosophy is in some sense owes some like debt to Kant and to Plato and whatever, right? Yeah, yes, that's true. They've shaped the way that people talk about things, the way that people think about things. Of course, they do, right? But then there's a separate claim, which is it's impossible to overcome those. Um,
Mm.
Maybe in a really deep sense, it's impossible to think totally neutrally, in the sense that like I'm not just a calculator that has an input and an output, and it's just, you know, maybe there's some kind of like influence, which you can't necessarily always eliminate. But like what's the, where are we going with this? Like as a, if someone becomes self-conscious of these things, they can to in certainly it seems to me in all relevant respects bracket those and think about the thing. At least if you're a good philosopher, to the extent that you're a good philosopher, possibly it be constitutive of being a philosopher is that you can bracket out things and not let them cloud the way that you're thinking about things. So like if we're talking about whether or not, I don't know, some theory of ethics is right, you know, utilitarianism or something. Maybe you're not a utilitarian. You find deontology to be much more persuasive. But let's just say we're talking about deontology. You wouldn't just say, look, the thing about Peter Singer is that he's utilitarian and I'm a deontologist. So that's why, you know, you bracket that. You say, look, let's just, for the sake of argument, examine what he says on its own merits. And this is basically doing an internal critique of someone else's point of view. You have to be able to bracket your own point of view. Right? That's another Van Tillian idea. So I think it's, aren't we just blowing out of all proportion the idea that we have background assumptions? I can bracket those strategically when I'm thinking about someone else's position. Are you saying that I can't? Because, I mean, is that a worldview? A worldview is like the things that you're unable to bracket for the sake of argument. Is that a definition that you'd use? I mean, because I mean, like it turns into just a claim that I'm biased in the relevant respect when we're talking about this thing.
Sure. I wouldn't say that biases are necessarily bad or things that you would even want to get rid of. I mean, maybe you have a bias towards helping women get jobs, or guys get jobs, or just people getting jobs. Maybe you have a bias towards not being a racist, right? Like it's not, biases are not necessarily.
Or I have a bias towards being fair. Right?
Sure. Okay. So, but I mean, I guess, yeah. So, but when you just start talking about bracketing these things, yeah, I would say I don't think you can get away from having a bias, because even if I'm at least not in the neutral sense of bias, I think you can get away from negative biases, but I don't think you can get away from having. I don't think you can get away from having these pre-commitments that are there behind your choices and the operations that you're doing with your mind, right?
But you can
My desire, my psychology, my biology, that's all things that I can't, you know, I can't arbitrate those things. I can slowly affect them, but even then I'm still dealing with desires that were already there. You know, I would have already had to have had the desire. I would have already had to have had it in my personality and in my more subconscious belief set and all of these things to do whatever I'm doing. Right? It would already have to be there, or it would have to be put there from outside of me, which is something I have no control over. Either way, I don't have some kind of ultimate control over even my control of my biases. I'm totally with you in you know, fighting against biases against people having jobs. Like I don't think that's cool, but
but you think that I can't overcome my bias against the existence or non-existence of whether your version of God exists, right?
not unless not unless it's put there by God. No, I would say the same thing of myself. Like I have no ability to, suppose I was biased in my presuppositionalism, and I should be a evidentialist. I would say I have no ability to overcome that negative desire or negative bias or whatever you want to call it, unless God were to help me along and to move me in the other direction. I think that he can act because he's an outside agent who can sort of extract and deposit things into me. But I don't. I have no ability to arbitrate from a third. There's no view from nowhere. I can't jump outside of myself to try and.
Yeah, but that isn't okay. So let's say we were having a conversation about ethics, and I was talking to you about so Peter Singer has this argument that I don't know, you shouldn't eat meat, and his reasons for it are blah blah blah, and like the principles he uses is that you kind of need to minimize suffering of persons or something, right? You wouldn't just go, yeah, but because God says that you're never allowed to kill or something. You wouldn't just be so I can't escape my commitment to there being a Christian God. You'd go, sure, Peter Singer's argument is weak on its own respects because he says this thing here and it contradicts himself there. Two things in the argument, right? You could bracket out pre-commitment to God and investigate whether or not Peter Singer's argument is good or bad. If you didn't do that, you would be rubbish at philosophy. You would have got nowhere. And it seems to me that you came to the idea that you can't bracket God. And right. Before that, you didn't have that pre-commitment.
Well, I would say.
Well, so it seems rather than an inability to bracket, you've just come to an unwillingness to bracket. It's a completely different attitude.
Sure, that's fair. Yeah.
Right. So if you're just limiting your own use of reason, you just don't want to bracket out a certain set of beliefs.
I guess if reason were, if use of reason, if that's a use of reason, then I would, I have to agree with you. That's not something I would be willing to I'll put it aside for the sake of argument, but I wouldn't be willing to put it aside as to my actual, the choices that I make in my life and the at least they're in the background. It would be part of the assumption here is
but it isn't there in the background. You're putting it there, and this is the difference. You didn't have that pre-commitment beforehand. It's not like saying I have an implicit bias. The guy didn't put that belief of gender inequality in his head. It was there beforehand, but you haven't always been a presuppositionalist. So at some point you put that unwillingness to suspend belief in God being the precondition for everything, like I was saying with the apple. You put that belief, well, you've just made an act of volition to hold that belief and not let go of it. And then you're saying that that's a presupposition, which it isn't. And then you're saying that everyone has presuppositions like that, which they don't, because I don't, and neither does my mum, and neither does a small child, and neither did you before you had this idea that everyone has presuppositions. I'm not trying to attack, but I'm getting to the point where I don't find this. I think you've been very honest and open, and I'm not seeing this as plausible very, very, very much. You've conceded, it seems to me, that I don't have to have fundamental ontological beliefs because I don't feel like I do. Unless you're going to just say that I do anyway, right?
Well,
do you?
Well, I would say, isn't that something that can be investigated? Can't we use our reasoning to see whether or not, just like your example with the guy who's choosing the blokes over the girls who are coming into, can't we investigate that? Isn't that something that we can look at and say, wait a second, let's just be cautious here. Let's be careful and say, wait a minute.
I think we can, and don't you think that I have?
Well, I would say maybe so, but I come away with different conclusions. Just to be honest, I would say I think you are. I don't really see any way of getting around the fact that you seem to be very committed to the idea that God is not a precondition of your of your existence and your life and the things that you do. You know, you did seem to be committed to the idea that that there's an ultimate changing factor to your worldview. I mean, Wittgenstein is just being a very sophisticated Heraclitus when he says that, to use the analogy that you gave from him, where our mental worlds are like a river where the top current flows very fast.
No, there's no commitment to it changing. It's just the ability to change. It's not. That's not a Heraclitus idea. Heraclitus says everything is in flux. Everything is always in flux. There's no such thing as identity over time. Wittgenstein isn't saying that you will, in fact, change your beliefs. He's saying there's no belief such that I wouldn't revise it in certain circumstances. It's not the same as being a Heraclitan about it. I'm not committed to a principle of change, right? I'm committed to. What I'm saying is that I'm not committed to anything so strongly that I wouldn't give it up in some circumstances. I don't know what those circumstances would be, but why limit my options down? It seems just like bad strategy.
But then you would have to be so either that principle is qualified in a way that I'm not privy to, or you are just saying even this principle is something that I would be willing to give up given the right circumstances.
Yeah, it is, and it's not self-contradictory to say that. Maybe I would be persuaded to become a presuppositionalist.
Right.
Which is just to say that I stop stop being open to certain things being true. Maybe I'll become dogmatic in my old age. I might do. I could be brainwashed into thinking that the Earth is flat. All sorts of things are possible, because at this point, epistemologically, self-consciously, I don't have a dogmatic belief, certainly to any kind of grand metaphysical principle. You know, is everything in flux? I don't know. Is everything one? I don't know. The ultimate atoms? I don't know. You know, why commit to any of these things? I enjoy metaphysics, but that doesn't mean that I am anything. I'm not a determinist. I'm not a libertarian. I'm not a anything. Like it's sort of sophomoric to just adopt these things and just have them. In fact, it doesn't do anything other than say how I described your attitude before as a kind of volition to stop being open to other positions. You're just saying, I choose to bury my head in this bit of sand. Okay. I mean, it doesn't mean doesn't signify, and it doesn't mean that's right. Just don't bury your head in any bit of sand. Just keep looking around as much as possible. That must be a strategic maxim that's sensible, right? Otherwise, we're back to where we started, which is that you're saying there's this bit of the world, reality, something or other, where you're not allowed to use your reason. And I just, as a principle for restricting the use of reason, I would say, why, right? And
right.
It seems to me that you have to answer that question, and then that's kind of just going round and round with it not being a prescribed area. You choose to stop reasoning about something, right? That's my point. Reason only ends when you stop reasoning by deliberately stopping. There is no actual stopping point for it. So that's why you shouldn't commit to a particular thing being 100% the truth, and I've got it and I'm possessing it. That's why you shouldn't do that. Anyway, sorry, I wanted to just finish that thought.
No, I'm glad you did. I think again, part of the difficulty is just as before when we were talking about, which is a pretty rare position that whenever you have a worldview that's false, it'll inherently be coherent, right? That is a commitment of my point of view. Just as when we were talking about that, I think also when you say we're not permitted to use our reason here. Well, part of the problem is what are our understandings of the use of reason there? Because I think I'm allowed to use my reasoning there. It's just I can't. I can't. Reason is not the sort of thing that can act as a tool to sort of unbridle myself from the very thing that I'm sitting on whenever I use reason. Like that doesn't, because the bias there is actually virtuous, and it's what even provides for my ability to go about reasoning at all. It's not something that I want to get rid of. But like, if I could jump on the point about not having the presupposition before, it's not so much that I didn't have the presupposition before, it's that I was unwittingly being intellectually dishonest whenever I would argue with people in a Cartesian sense, right? Because Cartesianism, I think, is not consistent with a proper exegesis of the holy book that I'm supposed to be committed to. So if I actually believe this holy book, and I believe Cartesianism, and it turns out that, hey, the holy book communicates things that contradict Cartesianism, I have a decision to make as part of my.
But Descartes was a Christian, right?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Well, at least I think he was, yeah.
Well, he said he was. I mean,
right.
So
he seemed to be, like, he talks like one.
Right. So whether or not it's consistent with biblical perspective or whatever, you've just made that decision yourself as well. Right? It's not that it is. It's that, I mean, maybe it is, right? But you can't. It's like you're shrugging off responsibility for the choice you made. You did. It's not like you stumbled across this. You stubbed your toe on the reality of Descartes not being compatible with the Bible. You've made the choice to say, like you even said it then, the things that you're supposed to believe, right, that were incompatible with it. Well, what you're supposed to believe isn't a part of reality, it seems to me. It's not an objective fact about what you're supposed to believe. It's up to you what you believe, right? It's weird to me that the idea that you have a body of thought that you're supposed to make everything else consistent with. And like, what is that body of thought you're supposed to make everything consistent with? Why think that? Why think that there is a body of thought that you have to cohere with? That's the Calvinist speaking. I have to make everything reconcile with this, with a book or with an interpretation of a book or with like these principles or those, and don't commit yourself to the propositions, but do commit yourself to the Westminster Confession and blah blah blah. Like, I don't know, if you had an independent way of getting to those things, and okay, but if you just have them as starting points for no reason other than, like, I mean, you're going to say they're just starting points, so there can't be any kind of ultimate reason for them, then you've just got well, so look, it seems to me that you've got rocks that you won't move regardless of how strong the stream is. Right?
Yeah, but I don't think that the difficulty, well, sure. I mean, I think with qualification, right? Because to me, the difficulty is not the use of reasoning here. It's specifically the independence that you put into the sentence there, right? Like, I don't believe there's such thing as independence from God, right? I think your statement about Van Til using the idea of metaphysical dependence is very insightful about what he was saying. Even if I'm not sure even I think I still have disagreements about the way that relates to presuppositional reasoning. But there is this concept inherent to the worldview that I'm bringing to the table that, yeah, I can't I can't stop breathing to talk to you, and no more could I stop relying on the existence of God. I could stop acknowledging it, right? But that doesn't mean it isn't there, and that doesn't mean I would.
If it's true, neither could I. But that's nothing to do with the way I think about the world, right? If there's there's an order of infinity between the natural numbers and the real numbers, nothing I could do could be true without that, right? If the continuum hypothesis is true, then everything in some sense that I say presupposes that it is true. But so what? It's completely independent of everything that I say. So I bracket it and move on, carrying on with my life one way or the other. You might be right. Maybe everything does metaphysically depend on God. But epistemologically, clearly, it seems to me clearly, it doesn't. I mean, like I said, defined you a notion of coherence that didn't certainly didn't explicitly reference God. You can only say that it metaphysically depends on God in the same way that I can say, ultimately everything kind of metaphysically presupposes the answer to the continuum hypothesis. But that's completely irrelevant. I mean, yes, I grant you, if God exists and made everything and everything is metaphysically dependent on him, then everything I say is metaphysically dependent on him too. If that starting hypothesis is correct, right? But that's not a significant or interesting claim, because that's true for any claim that has a kind of level of objective truth to it, right? If the continuum hypothesis is true, if everything is ultimately made of fire, blah blah blah, all of these things that claim something to be true kind of metaphysically, then yeah, everything else kind of presupposes that it's true, if it's true, right? So you have an uninteresting claim then, right? It doesn't intersect with epistemology at all.
Yeah, well, that's where I think is the that's where I would disagree with the article that you wrote. I thought I was very interested when you brought up Straussonian presuppositional reasoning. I thought, oh, that's interesting, because I know Van Til's going to. I was wondering how you were going to bridge the two, because I know Van Til is very much at odds with a lot of the sort of methods and reasonings of just the analytic tradition in general, and so I thought that was very interesting. That came up, but just yeah, I don't see the disconnect there. The position that I'm advocating here is not that God is just metaphysically dependent, but that the metaphysical story of our knowledge, that the very event of us having any kind of existence and reasoning and just our very lives of just drinking coffee and going down to the coffee shop and talking, anything that we're doing is constantly swimming in this world of his revelation.
Yeah, okay, but so I come up with a story that's different to that, and then and the consequence of my story is, so my story is, I don't know, some really obvious naturalistic thing, which is the universe is all that there is, everything's physical, blah blah blah. So then it's a consequence of that if we go down and have a coffee and talk to each other about whether God exists, actually everything kind of metaphysically depends on a world in which God doesn't exist. Okay, so that's true for your theory, it's true for my theory. But again, that doesn't mean anything. It's just a consequence of what happens when you pontificate about what metaphysics is like. Then that's going on in the background when you have a coffee, if what you said is true, right? But bring those two things together in some way. Even if you say, on my theory, I couldn't have knowledge unless God existed, I'd say, okay, well, I make up a theory where, unless this green apple was green, you couldn't have knowledge. Right. Okay, again, it's just, you're not bridging the gap here. You're just saying, if what I said is true, then, you have to think the way that I'm thinking. But it doesn't follow that you have to think the way you're thinking, right? Because you have to establish that it's true first for that story. Right, for all of these stories, if they're true, then such and such follows. And is it actually true though, right? I mean, and it seems to me the presuppositionalist is mixing up the destination and the starting point by saying, but unless it was true, you wouldn't be able to think about things. But that's only true if it, that consequence of it being true follows from it being true. It's not a reason to think that it's true, and it's a property that every sort of fundamental speculation into what the nature of the world is like has as well. So there's nothing special about this view. It's just another view saying, well, if everything's water, then every time we have a coffee, we just 2 bits of water, drinking another bit of water, or whatever. Yeah, okay, yeah, great. And there must be something more interesting than that. I mean, why do you think that it's true?
Yeah, I think, well, just to note 2 things that I think are very unique about it. For one thing, I think the Abrahamic religions, I think there's problems with, obviously I think there's problems with Islam and rabbinical Judaism today and other subsets of Judaism. But the unique thing about the Abrahamic religions is these weren't speculations into the nature of reality. These weren't stipulations. Somebody didn't just sit down and try to think all this out. This is not the Upanishads or I don't know, this, you know, the teachings of Zarathustra. Like these were revelational events where God came down in time and history and, you know, writ these things.
No.
That's fine if you don't believe
the
that.
claim is that that's what happened. Just like in, you know, Thales' view, the claim is that everything is fire. You can't say
Right.
different because it actually is true, right?
Well, that would assume that it's not, right? Like,
no, I'm just not assuming that it is. Again, you've slipped in between the kind of wide and narrow scope negation here. I'm not assuming that it's false, but if I assume that what Thales said is true, you know, then you know, that's why Thales' metaphysics is different from the Abrahamic religions, because actually everything really is fire. And, you know, and this Abrahamic views, it's just an idea that someone just made up that God came down and gave a revelation, when in actual fact everything is fire. Right? You can't just start by saying the reason that it's different from all these other things is that it's true. Great.
I don't think that. Yeah, that wasn't my point. Whether you want to say if it's true or whether you want to say it's true, I believe it's true, so I'll just say it's true. But sure, you know, if it's true, this is not a religion where people sat down and had wise sayings. This is not a religion where people sat down and a guy gave them teaching on his own authority. This is a religion that says there's this God who steps into the universe, there's this God who steps into time and space and hands down these revelations. So it's not a speculative metaphysic. It's very different from a lot of, like, if you read German idealism, you're reading speculation. You're reading what some guy thought up on while he was on the toilet. Like, no offense, but that's really what this is. There may be some great bits of wisdom in it, but that's really all it is.
No. The difference between a philosophy and a religion is that a philosophy is conclusions that have arguments supporting them, whereas a religion, you don't even think that the starting point has an argument supporting it, right?
I wouldn't say
you
that.
think
right?
that the difference between the Abrahamic religions and the Upanishads is that what the Abrahamic religions claim happened actually did happen, and that's not an argument. That's just another claim, right? And that's not, so philosophy isn't like just what someone made up on the toilet. The reasoning is something that they made up, but whether or not the reasoning works isn't just something that they made up. Whereas with you, the truth about your claim isn't supported by anything, right? It seems to me that you're just making up that it's true, and you may as well do that on the toilet.
Well, okay, but the point I'm making is that for just to use the example again, the German idealists started with imagination, which is just another word for.
What do you mean? Speculation. They started with imagination. What does that mean?
That means they sat down and they introspect about what's going on in the mind and what's going on in the world.
Yeah, and then what helped them? What navigated their way through their introspections? Did they just make it up and they just said everything was right that they thought of?
Well, a lot of things. Like you've already mentioned the fact that they bring up a lot of arguments for the ideas that they came up with. Exactly.
Kant, if you read Kant, he's not just saying, oh, I don't know, let's say this is true and such other thing is true. Like there's, I mean, for the most part, actually, but where he's exemplary is by giving, you know, big system where everything like follows and there's like reasons and just arguments for the parts that it's going on, and where something's an assumption, it's given as an assumption. It's just like, you know, this is a starting point or whatever, this follows from it. So the kind of axiom theorem distinction, and that's what typifies philosophy. So, yeah, maybe the axioms are like plucked out of thin air, but then, you know, it's at least open what's going on. I mean, you're claiming that the axioms are true, whereas a philosopher is claiming that the theorems follow from the axioms. It's a completely different type of claim, right?
I'm not sure I would agree with that. I think that I think if you asked Kant if his system was true, I think he would say it's true. That's kind of his argument. There are many philosophers who would only say that their theorem follows from their action. I would completely agree with you there, but I don't think all philosophers are that way. I don't think that's the nature of. I don't think there's some kind of like stratum, you know, to philosophy that it only goes so far as to say that the theorems follow from the the axioms. Like part of when Paul went to the Areopagus and he's arguing with the Epicureans, right? Like it wasn't just a matter of, well, Paul, you're wrong if my axioms are right. No, they thought he was ridiculous. They thought he was teaching religious nonsense. And if their axioms are right, then he was teaching religious nonsense, and Christianity is.
I don't know that Paul has an argument in that bit. Acts, isn't it? What does Paul say there? He basically presups the Epicureans, right? That's the
right.
The Banson reading of it, anyway. I mean, so how does that work?
So he points out the fact that they it's actually very much like a first century version of the argument that I would give against treating the tag as an argument from elimination. He points out the fact that they are very religious. They have these intellectual commitments to worship, but they openly admit in their metaphysic that this thing they're worshiping isn't something they can communicate. It's not something that they actually have rational access to. They don't know who this God is. And Paul points out, wait, that's a contradiction. You can't if you're going to say that there is this God, that's a mystery that we worship. If you're going to say that there's something that metaphysically accounts for all of reality, but you're going to say you don't know what it is, then you've lost all ground by which you could tell me that it's not the Christian God. So I'm going to say that it is the Christian God. Here I am telling you what, in fact, that metaphysical thing that you just granted me is. It's Yahweh. Now, who are you? What ground do you have to say that it's not? Because you've already admitted I don't know who it is.
Okay, so if I said someone's just knocked on the door and I don't know who it is, and you say, oh, well, it must be my friend Jimmy, right? Oh, how are you going to say that it isn't? That's not an argument that it is Jimmy, right? That's just, you're just saying, well, you don't know who it is, so I'm going to say that I do. That's not, how is that an argument? That seems to me like, if that's the argument, then why does that persuade you? I mean, I'm making a counterexample like really easily.
Right.
So have you failed to convince me, portray the argument properly, or does my counterexample not characterize what you were doing?
Yeah, I think the problem with the analogy is that the person at the doorway is, again, one of those more trivial facts that we're not really. I don't know if somebody who would base like, why do I believe in this coffee cup? Well, because there's a person at the doorway. Like I don't know of a person who would like base their beliefs and their living and their intellectual processes on that sort of thing. But
yeah, so look, but you said you gave this as an argument, and it didn't involve, when you gave the argument, that the belief was foundational. And what I did was constructed an argument which mimicked the reasoning, but which showed that the conclusion didn't follow. And now what you're saying is that the original argument actually has something to do with it being that their belief was foundational, when it didn't play any role in the argument beforehand. So, I mean, that seems an unfair way of going back. You're like saying, well, so you must be saying, you're taking the first out, you're saying I didn't really represent the argument properly because there's this extra element to it. So if you go give the argument again, but now with it being clear that the belief being fundamental matters, so start again.
Sure, right. I mean, that's why Paul quotes the Greek poets in that in Acts 17, right? Even as your own poets say, what is it? In him we live and move and have our being, or whatever. It's very much like his Romans address. But yeah, this is obviously a comment on what you were talking about before with the metaphysical dependence. And what Paul is pointing out is just, look, you're right, you are metaphysically dependent on God. But since you're telling me you don't know who it is, what basis would you have to say that it's not Yahweh?
Yeah, right. But then, so that's the same argument again. It doesn't make any difference that okay, so let's say before you were convinced that, I don't know, maybe you've always been a Christian, but before you were a presuppositionalist, let's say, and you said, oh, I'm not really quite sure how to, like, what theology I should take on. And I said to you, oh, well, in that case, Aquinas should be your theological, like, guru. And you go, should it? And I go, yeah. Well, you don't know who to take on as a theological guru, so therefore, what basis do you have for saying that it shouldn't be Aquinas? Right? Don't read Calvin. Read Aquinas. You don't know who to take on, so therefore you should take on this. I'm addressing a fundamental worldview point here. But you're going to tell me that's not the right argument. That's not analogous, right? But
No, I think it's
right, unless you're going to say that it is analogous, and I don't think you will.
well. I think that's a fair critique, but I think in that analogy, my response would be, wait a second, because my standard is, I do have these standards that I would bring to critique whether or not Aquinas is the correct theological standard, right? Like, does Aquinas meet those standards, right? If in this analogy I actually don't have any theological standards, yeah, then I have no basis by which to say yes Aquinas or no Aquinas.
Oh, no, it's not just that, though. Obviously, if you don't know whether to believe in Aquinas or not, then you don't know whether to believe in Aquinas or not, of course. The point is, if you don't know whether to believe in Aquinas or not, and I tell you that therefore you should, that you say, oh, it follows that I should. It doesn't follow that you should, does it?
Well, what I would say is, if Aquinas is, if the theology of Aquinas is an example of a worldview that we're using here, and you're saying, look, you don't have a theology for your worldview. You don't have a theological worldview. You don't have a basis for saying Aquinas' theological worldview is wrong. Therefore, Aquinas' theological worldview is true. Yeah, I think that's a fair way of persuasion. Yeah, this
so you think that that's right, that argument works?
Yeah, because the person has no basis for saying that it is or it isn't, or one where it has no way of looking at anything.
He doesn't have any way of saying that it's false, but that doesn't mean that it isn't false.
No, but he doesn't have a way of saying that it's true. Like, he
doesn't
have.
I know, but I grant you, he doesn't know one way or the other. But that doesn't mean that it is one way or the other, right?
Well, no, wait, real quick. He doesn't have a way of saying that it is, but that doesn't mean he can't do it, right?
Sure. So I don't know who's at the door, but it doesn't mean I can't answer the door. But the thing is, before we've answered the door, my state of ignorance doesn't mean that someone can tell me that means it's Jimmy.
But I think that your worldview allows you not to use the person at the door as indispensable to your system, right? If we're talking about Aquinas' theology as like a system of thought, and you're saying I don't have a system of thought, I have nothing to go off of.
Yeah, okay, so I would say I have nothing. I've just woken up out of hypersleep. I don't remember anything. I have no idea how to think about the world. And then someone comes along and says, oh, so you should be a Mooney, right? Does that mean I should?
But how?
I agree. I wouldn't be able to know why I shouldn't. But it's not about, so the conclusion isn't about whether I know how. It's that I should. Like, is it true that I should be a Mooney just because I don't know anything? It's not true. It's obviously not true, right? If there's any reason to be a Mooney, that's independently of whether I know that there's any reason to be a Mooney. I mean, I can't believe that you are trying to suggest that that's the other way around.
Well, because I think in the case of the Mooneyism, we're not. Let it be clear that Mooneyism is a worldview that accounts for.
No, it doesn't have to be, because you don't know whether it does or not. Maybe Jimmy couldn't be at my door because he's in Vancouver or whatever. Maybe it couldn't be, but because I don't know whether Jimmy's at the door and you tell me that he is, does it mean that I should believe that he is? No, it doesn't. And just, if I wake up from hypersleep, maybe Mooneyism is complete bollocks, like it probably is. It's just because someone tells me, I can't tell him that it isn't, so therefore I should believe it. It doesn't follow, and that's Paul's argument, and it doesn't follow there either.
But then aren't we suggesting that Paul is, in other words, in order for that to be analogous, wouldn't we have to suggest that Paul is saying something arbitrary that doesn't suggest an account of reality? But I think that is.
It doesn't matter that what he's saying is an account for reality. That's not part of the argument. I mean, it happens that the content that he's talking about is. So, like, if I said to you, sorry, let's go back. So let's take the example of being whether Jimmy's at the door or not, right?
Whether I'm at the door, yeah.
Yeah, and then you said, oh, well, look, hold on, that argument doesn't, because we're talking about questions that have to do with who's at whose door, right? That means it's different. You'd say to me, no, whether it's someone at the door or whether it's the apple is green or whether it's blah, 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 it doesn't matter. That's not the salient to the the argument. It's just what I've just plugged in arbitrary values to illustrate the type of reasoning involved.
Oh,
Right?
sure.
Whether it's about fundamental worldviews or whether it's about someone who's at the door doesn't matter. The point is, if you don't know X and someone says, because you don't know X, therefore you should believe X, it doesn't matter whether it's X, what X is. It's just that reasoning is invalid, right? Doesn't follow that you should believe it just because you don't know that X is true.
Right. But I don't think that's when you're talking about the person at the door. You're not suggesting that the person at the door is the very thing that gives you the ability to decide whether it's the person at the door. Right. That's why your Apple analogy was so genius, because you included the predicate that, you know, this is the apple, that you can't decide whether it's green unless you believe in the apple, right? But that's I think the distinction here. When you're talking about you know, whether there's crackers in my pantry, right? Like, that's the classic Bonson example, right? There are certain means to go about figuring that out, but it's not at least no one that I know of is committed to crackers as their first principle, like as the basis, you know, the Archimedean point of their system. But that's what Paul's talking about here. Paul's coming to them and saying, look, you worship a God that you don't name, which means you're giving up any kind of ground by which to disagree with anybody. You can't disagree with the Hindus when they come across the sea. You can't disagree with Hegel if he had a time machine and could come back with you. Like, you've revoked your ability to say, no, you're wrong about who this God is, because you don't know who he is, right? But
okay, so yeah, obviously they look. Yes, they would agree. The shrine to the unknown God isn't to a God that they know. Okay, and actually Paul says that you do know him, and it's this God.
Right.
But it doesn't follow that because they don't know who he is, that it is in fact Jehovah, which is how you gave the argument a minute ago. That argument's invalid. It doesn't follow. Right, and then saying that they do know who he is, saying that here's this shrine to the unknown God. Oh, you do know who it is. Like, I don't even see that as an argument. That's just like somebody saying the door's open. No, it's shut. No, it is open. Whatever. When you're looking at it, and it's shut. It's like we're not having, like, this is an argument in the sense of like two people shouting at each other, not an argument in the sense of like a philosophical argument. It's a claim and a counterclaim. Right? It doesn't get you anywhere. But the point is that the argument you gave before, either you've misrepresented the argument or it's invalid.
It's possible it's very possible I misspoke. But again, I think maybe the distinction there is that I'm saying, look, this person doesn't have this thing accounted for on his worldview. According to his system of thought, right? According to his beliefs, he doesn't know who this is. He doesn't have an ability to distinguish whether it's a male or a female God, for example, right? It's just
okay, great. So what follows from that, though?
Well, it follows that they don't even have the ability to say that they do or don't know who this God is, right?
No,
they don't
of course, yeah. That's the statement you're starting with. They don't know who it is, therefore they don't know who it is. Okay, great. Is there anything else from that?
Yeah, then they can't say that that this is the kind of person that they can go about their lives living independently without acknowledging. They have no ability to say that it's not that kind of person.
Yeah, okay, great. So, fine. But as soon as you start to say, well, it is this other person, then you've gone further than what follows from the fact that they don't know who it is, right? Like with the Jimmy's at the door example. I don't know who's at the door, therefore it's Jimmy at the door. Doesn't follow, right?
I don't see what the issue is there. Like, if one is committed to the unknowability of some object that explains the universe, what ability would I have to say that it's not necessarily this God that you're talking about?
If my starting point is I don't know who the shrine to the unknown God is for, right? It's a weird example because like it isn't really for anyone. If you knew who it was, that they wouldn't be that God. But let's just, take the kind of Kantian example of like, what's the world really like independently of our forms of intuition or something. Like, I don't know whether it's really causal, say, whether causality is something I impose on it or not. right? Is the world really causal? I don't know. So you could say it is causal, and I wouldn't be able to tell you that you're wrong, but it wouldn't follow that you're right, would it? Even though I can't tell you that you're wrong, it doesn't follow that you're right just because I can't tell you that you're wrong. You claim causality is inherent in the world, and I say, well, I follow Kant, and I think I can't know whether causality is inherent in the world. And you say, well, it is. Right? Does it follow that you're right? Did you win that argument? I don't think you did.
No, but I think that you wouldn't say that. I don't think that you would say that are incapable of going on and questioning these things and reasoning about these things with or without respect to, you know, the causal nature or a causal nature of reality, right?
Well,
whereas Paul's pointing out, look, you guys are committed to the fact that you know, there's this God that makes sense of everything that's here, right? In him you move and live and have your being. But now you're saying you don't know who it is. Like, then what are you talking about? Like, you've contradicted yourself. You've revoked your own ability to start telling other people that there are these gods and stuff, right? Here in fact is the truth about the matter, right? So yeah, you're right. Like, nothing follows. If we're just sticking with their worldview, nothing would follow from their worldview, because they're just saying, you know, there's some principle out there that explains all this. There's some being out there who explains all this, but we don't know who it is. Well, then, how do you even know that he's a principle that explains anything? Like,
yeah, sure. I mean, it doesn't. I mean, let's just say that. I mean, but it seems to me that Paul's move is to go in and say, "Oh, you've got this shrine to the unknown God," and like in Sophocles or whatever, there's this line that says, whatever it was that you quoted, in him we all move and breathe, or something, whatever, right? So you think that there's this thing that you're ultimately dependent on. I'm not quite sure that's the best representation of the Greek metaphysics, but let's say that it was, right? And then they did think there's this. Basically, Paul is painting them, strawmanning, I would say, that the Greeks had a latent Christian belief, but all they did was just paint a big question mark over the Christian God, and he's saying, "Da-da, it's the Christian God, and you all knew it all along," right? That is Paul's way of describing what happened when he went to Greece. I reckon if we had the Epicurean scribes' account of what happened, that they would say something along the lines of, Paul came along and said, we don't know who the God is to the unknown God shrine, and then he tried to tell us that he did, and we asked him why, and he said, because you all already know, and we said that's not an argument, and he got in a huff and walked out, and that's basically probably what they would have said about what happened. I mean,
I think you're right, but that's the key problem there, right? Is they ask why. Why in what sense? Why in the sense that it's true, or why in the sense that you actually think you have an ability to doubt it? Because thinking that you have an ability to doubt it would presuppose that you actually know this being, which you just
no, it doesn't.
You don't.
Why would it presuppose that? If I say, look, I don't know who's at the door, and you say it's Jimmy, and I go, is it? Why should I think that? I'm not presupposing that it isn't Jimmy. I'm just going, what is it? I mean, could be. Why do you think? Are you expecting Jimmy? Have you got a reason to think Jimmy's here? Got an argument that proves Jimmy's at the door? You know, like, I'm just asking you why. I'm not presupposing that he's not at the door.
But you would be presupposing that he's not indispensable to your system at that point.
I'm presupposing that he could be at the door. I'm not presupposing that. I'm presupposing that it's not impossible that he's at the door.
But you're presupposing that it's possible that he's not at the door.
Yeah, like, it's epistemically possible that he's at the door. Like, sure, absolutely.
That's the possibility of the contrary, right? What Paul is pointing out here is, look, you guys, when you ask that question, why, that question only makes sense in light of if it's actually possible that the contrary is the fact.
Okay, so
but you have no way of establishing the possibility of the contrary. You just gave that up when you said, I don't know who this is.
No. I didn't give up. So when I said I don't know who's at the door, right?
Sorry, this is...
And then you say Jimmy's at the door, and I say, is it? Why do you think that, right? I suppose you could say, fair enough, in that the sentence, why do you think Jimmy's at the door, presupposes that it's possible that Jimmy's at the door. Maybe it does that, right? Let's just say that it does. Am I presupposing that it's not impossible that Jimmy's at the door? I'm not presupposing that it's metaphysically impossible that Jimmy's at the door. Right, so I'm saying, so let's say, so metaphysic and epistemic possibility don't have that correlation to each other. Right? My thinking that something's epistemically possible doesn't say anything about what's metaphysically possible. So let's say, for all I know, it's possible, as in it's epistemically possible, that there's a meteorite that's just about to hit the Earth. Right? It could be, for all I haven't, because the curtains are drawn, I don't know. Maybe there is this huge fireball that's visible outside my window, and it's just about to hit the Earth, right? It's epistemically possible. Also, of course, it's epistemically possible that that's not going to happen. So for me, it's epistemically contingent whether I'm about to be destroyed by a fireball, right?
Right.
On the other hand, if there isn't, in actual fact, a meteorite just about to hit the Earth, it isn't metaphysically possible that I'm just about to be hit by a meteorite, right?
Right.
So my not knowing either way round doesn't say anything about I'm not pre-committed metaphysically to one or the other. I'm doubting epistemically, there could be or there couldn't be, but I'm not saying I'm committed to the metaphysical possibility being either way. I know that the metaphysical possibility is kind of closed, either one or the other, and not either. But epistemically, I'm either, right? So it seems to me there's a misunderstanding of how, my epistemic and my metaphysical pre-commitments just don't work the way that you're saying that they do. Right? You can't read any metaphysical pre-commitments out of my epistemic sort of ambiguity.
I mean, as far as I'm aware, when you use that analogy, and you use the word meteor, there's beliefs there about the nature of a meteor, right? Like I think both of us are aware of what a meteor is, and so I think the analogy has difficulty then when we come back and we look at the passage with, in Acts 17, where they're saying, look, we're not acquainted with this God. We don't actually know who it is, what it is, what's going on. It's just this altar to the unknown God. But the meteor analogy plays off of the fact that the meteor is the kind of thing that can or may not happen.
Yes, but the analogy works because
happen,
the God that I don't know whether it exists or not, I don't know what it's like. But it's true. You're not suggesting that God could both exist and not exist. It's the kind of thing that either exists or doesn't. Just like the meteor is the kind of thing that's either just about to hit my house or it isn't. So actually, the analogy is completely fine to that objection. I mean,
but how do you know that it isn't the sort of thing that's preconditional to your knowledge? Like, how do you know it's the sort of thing?
Even if it is, the point is whether its existence is black or white, regardless of whether it's preconditional to my knowledge. Right? You're not claiming a fuzzy, ontologically indistinct God, right? So to that extent, then it's just like the meteor. My inability to know whether it exists is fuzzy and contingent, and I'm neither one nor the other. But its actual existence is one or the other. And I know if that's the type of God you're talking about, then I'm ontologically pre-committed to it must be black or white one way or the other. But my epistemic state is completely indeterminate. So it's the same.
Right,
it's the same.
But what I'm saying is, there in the analogy, you're acquainted with the idea of a meteor. Like, you know things about a meteor, and because you're aware of its nature, you can say that you're open to the epistemic freedom, because there's nothing about a meteor that suggests that it's the kind of thing that must be known or that cannot not be known. But you would have no basis for saying that about the Anchalaga which we just define as the thing which is necessarily known. Like, unless you have a system that can do without it, unless you have a system of thought that can say, I don't need the Anchalaga because I have this necessary being over here who substitutes for that and does all that, and that would be the sort of religious argument that goes on between like a Christian and a Mormon or a Hindu or something, right? We could have arguments about the metaphysics of our different gods. But in the case of the Greeks here, what they're saying is, look, we're not even acquainted with this being. We don't know what they're like. But then on what basis could you say that they're the kind of being such that they can not be known to exist. Like, how would you know that? You've revoked your ability to say that now, because you've just admitted you're not acquainted with this being.
If I say that I don't know that it exists, I'm at least ruling out the type of things that couldn't not be known to exist.
Yes. Yes. That's the problem, right? Because the person here is trying to be open. The person is saying, like, look, because the whole concept of, or I shouldn't say the whole concept, at least one interpretation of these ancient paganisms is that they want to be open to there's political reasons to be open to the existence of these other gods. That when we come into contact with another country, we want to accept, okay, you have your gods, we have our gods, that's fine, right? This is henotheism thing. Okay, so they have this unknown god type thing, and personally, my interpretation is it's for that political reason. Whatever reason it was, as soon as you've said, there's this unknown God, you've made a universal negative. You're saying there is something out there, but I know it's not the Christian God because I don't believe any of that Christian monotheism stuff. I'm not part of that Jewish cult over there that thinks that's the only God and he's revealed himself. Right?
No. Now what you're doing is you're saying you could think that you don't know it, but that you actually do. I mean, yeah, maybe that's true. Okay, so, but that's just
I'm just trying
very, very, like, I mean, so if you go to a therapist and he tells you that you're you're repressed about your sexual feelings towards your mother, and you say that you're not, I don't think that I am, doesn't seem like I am, he's going to go, exactly, that's repression speaking. Right? And there's no way out of that for you. You can't say anything. He sees everything as confirmation of his hypothesis. And especially if you say, yeah, gee, it must be true. And he's like, absolutely, it is true. So there's no way out of that. But it's really easy to do that. Like anyone can hoist you desperately think that, and maybe I say to you, you're an atheist, right? Everyone's an atheist. You know God doesn't exist. Even though you think that you have to know that God exists, that's just how deep your repression is, right? This really cheap way of arguing.
Right, and there are Christians and atheists and others who do that sort of thing. But I don't think that's what I'm trying to point out here. What I'm trying to point out here is when the Greek says, "Hey, look, there's this God out there." But by the way, it's not known to be the Yahweh God. You're just saying it's not Yahweh then, because Yahweh is defined as the kind of being who is known. Like he's defined as this.
Yeah, but so how does that not involve the claim that the person who is in a state of uncertainty about it isn't in fact in a state of uncertainty about it? You have to at some point hoist the psychoanalysts' denial move. Because look, so I'm the Epicurean in the forum, and I'm like, hey, I don't know who it is. You're going to have to say, I mean, either that rules out this God that everyone knows because I don't know who it is, right? So it can't be that God that everybody knows. Otherwise, I'd know who it was, right? Either it rules that out logically, or I do in fact know, and I'm wrong about it. So if Paul is right, then it must be the psychoanalyst move, where he's saying, even though you think you don't know, you do, right? Even though it doesn't feel like you're in denial, you are. So you can't escape that. I mean, Paul's either pulling the psychoanalyst move or he's wrong, because they don't know who it is, and he's saying they do.
I'm not really following how Paul is just saying, look, no, just despite the fact that you think you know, you don't, or despite the fact that you think you don't know, you do. Like, I mean, he is saying they know that, but what I don't see is he doesn't seem to be saying that as just some kind of brute interpretation of this God. What at least my interpretation of the subtlety of his argument is he's pointing out, look, you guys are saying you don't know this God. You don't have acquaintance with him. You don't know what he's like. What grounds then would you have to establish that it's not, in fact, this God over here who claims to be known?
Well, now you've just gone back to the Jimmy's at the door thing again. Okay, I don't know who's at the door, so I can't say it's not Jimmy. Okay.
I mean, maybe I'm just going in a circle, but I don't see how.
Look, I think what you want to say is you don't know who it is, and you think that it could be any of these gods, right? But by saying it could be any of these gods, you're ruling out one of the gods, which is the god that you already
Yes.
know who it is, right? So, but
Right.
right, but then that has to be that they only think they don't know who it is, but in fact they do, right? So we are in fact back to the psychoanalyst move.
Oh, I see. Okay, I don't think that that's what the psychoanalyst is doing. I think the
He is.
psychoanalyst is just.
Well, even if he's not, then it's anyone you can erect that move for anybody, right? So like I did with you, it just said, okay, you actually do know that atheism is true, right? Any claim you can say of another person's inner mind that it's in fact this way, even though it doesn't seem like it is, right? And then anything they say is kind of like explained by their kind of rebellion or denial or something, and like anyone can do that, and
but that's not the explanation. The problem is that the difference is that in the case of me and you, for example, I'm not claiming that atheism is actually possible, right? This person over here is saying it could actually be any of these gods, including Yahweh, when by that very statement they're committing a contradictio in adjective, like they've just contradicted themselves in that worldview where you say any of these gods are possible, including Yahweh, is just a contradiction in terms. Because as soon as you've said any other god besides Yahweh is possible, you're saying Yahweh is impossible, even though you're also at the same time saying Yahweh is possible, and that's part of your worldview.
No.
Contradictory worldview. It's encoded. But when you say to me, like, no, atheism is absolutely true, and in fact, you also know it. What I would say is, okay, fair. That's your perspective. I have a different perspective. Let's argue about that. I believe that I can account for reality apart from invoking some kind of atheistic point of view. Let's go to the mat over that. Let's see whether we can.
We went there, but this is silly to go there, because I'll just say that we go to the apple thing, and I just say anything you think is a way of determining it is just what you think that it's a way of determining it, because you don't already believe the apple is green. You can't win that argument because it's just a stalemate. You're not really latching onto anything that makes sense. I'm just rolling back from the common ground and just saying, anything you say, even if you had a valid argument, right? You only think so because the apple's green. You only think that because you don't already believe the apple is green. Right. So it's never going to win there. I'm sorry, but that's like the cheat code for this like battle of the worldview games, is that you just make any arbitrary object and claim that that's the precondition of intelligibility and just stick to that. You're never going to beat me there. I'm never going to beat you either. It's just a stalemate.
But with respect, I don't think that's the type of argumentation that we take. Like, I definitely think that's an explanation. Like, okay, so let's just suppose, for the sake of argument, that whatever atheistic system, let's just be creative here. Let's say it's atheistic idealism, like, and that is that is not only necessary, but there's some conceptually indispensable content to atheistic idealism that means you have to know it. It's innate to you, and everything that you're doing, blah blah blah. Okay, is the person willing then to do internal critique? If not, then yeah, you're right. Like, okay,
look, go and do an internal critique on my Apple view. Go for it. See what happens.
But that's what I told you. Is in the case of somebody who believes in the apple, or like in a real life scenario where there's a Hindu, I would ask him about what is the nature. What do you believe about these? About this thing.
Honestly, do it. What is honestly?
Well, that's a little. That would be a waste of time, wouldn't it? Because you don't actually believe.
No, it's not a waste of time because it shows the redundancy of the method. I can pick any arbitrary object and just play the game, and you won't get anywhere. So okay, I'll do it. I'll play both sides because you don't want to engage with this. But so the interlocutor says, "Oh, well, how do you account for logic on this worldview where the greenness of the apple is the necessary precondition of intelligibility?" Well, the thing is, that's not logic just is intelligible, and if you don't think that the apple is green, you wouldn't know. You wouldn't even be able to frame the question. How is it that logic could be intelligible? That question only makes sense if you believe that the apple is green. Right? You're thinking that there's a yardstick that's independent of the apple's greenness is your mistake. Right? So, and that just works for anything. It's trivial. It's like, it's not even, Like we've just retreated to the point of where like I just closed the drawbridge and so do you. Neither of us is going to win that game. Because, and like I said, anything you want to say, I'll just claim that the apple's greenness is the thing that you have to believe for that thing to make sense.
Wittgenstein's shouting from different ivory towers, huh?
Yeah, right. So I mean,
Yeah.
that's an argument for why we shouldn't bother going down that route. Is it gets you nowhere?
Yeah, I don't. I think someone is fair to have that explanation there. And and I think I have had conversations with people where their explanation is, yeah, I know that can be very deceiving, and I know you're deluded in that way. But listen, you gotta hear why this is problematic. And okay, for the sake of argument, like, fine, let's just say I'm deluded. Let's move on now. Okay, now that that's your explanation, what can you explain to me about what is your position? What are these beliefs that you have? Like, give to me the message that you're trying to give here, and let's see what it is. Let's investigate it, because I honestly don't think that's an issue. I think whether people want to admit it, at least this is my position. I'm not trying to force other people to believe this, but my position is that actually is the state everyone is in. Everyone is in these ivory towers. One of those ivory towers actually has the way to bridge to to the other ivory towers, and to blow them up from the inside, and to try to get people back into the original ivory tower.
You think that because you're doing the move that I just made with the apple. The apple guy thinks that he's got the move. The bridge to the other guy and exploding them is the greenness of the apple.
But I never said you were deluded, or that you. I never used as an argument that, oh, look, Alex, you know God, and you're quite self-deceived about it. Like, that's not my argument. My argument was to ask questions about. At least I was trying to be very Socratic about, in trying to challenge the very respectable challenge that I think you've given to Reformed apologetics in your articles. My challenge was, I don't know how to interpret your argument to inductive elimination, except to say that it is either committed to pluralism, which I don't think is cogent, or it just doesn't understand the nature of a worldview, and that sort of tension seems to,
well, I mean, look, I think we now move to a different point, because I think that maybe that's true, that the notion of worldview is something that I've found to be very difficult to get a clear handle on. But let's not pretend that that's what we were talking about a minute ago, because we were talking about Paul's argument, right, which is
sure.
Which does require claiming that the person who says they don't know who God is does know who God is. Otherwise, the argument doesn't work. Because if I'm right, say I'm the Epicurean, if I'm right that I don't know who God is, that means it's not the Christian God. Because if the Christian God is defined as the God, or any of the gods who are defined as the gods that you already know, right? This random apple God that you know that it's the apple God, right?
Right.
It does rule out those gods, that's true. But that doesn't mean that that doesn't mean that it is obviously it doesn't mean that it is the Christian God. It doesn't mean that it is the apple God. Then it doesn't, nothing follows from it apart from, and if you want to say, you haven't considered the fact that you're actually deceived about your own internal state, and that maybe you do know who it is, and it's one of these gods that everybody already knows, right? Then you've pulled the psychoanalyst move, right? So the argument doesn't work unless you pull the psychoanalyst move. And if you pull the psychoanalyst move, then we just retreat into a stalemate where I pull the psychoanalyst move as well, and then it's game over. Or if you want to say, you couldn't pull the psychoanalyst move unless you already had God who supports everything, I say, well, you couldn't say that unless you believed in the apple being green, right? So I just don't see how this, like, I'm not misrepresenting the position, it seems to me. That is the position. Maybe I'm quite happy to be given a better version of Tag, or a different version of worldview or something, but I don't see how, Paul's argument goes nowhere, it seems to me. And you might want to go away and have a think about that and come back to me and tell me how it works. But the way we've got through it this evening, they say, I don't know who God is. And you say, well, maybe it's this God that you do know who it is. It is the God who you don't know who it is. Like the argument's invalid, but anyway, it's just revolves on this like move that they could pull on him, and then that's why it doesn't work. It's like a game. It's not proper philosophy. It's not really philosophy. It's just a game. It's the sort of thing someone comes along who's trying to sell you a used car would say. It's not something who's like a critic of cars who's actually giving you an informed view would say. Anyway,
Yeah,
I have to go because I've already been longer than I said I would.
It sounded like you're trying to. I know it's later. It's a lot later there than it is here. So
yes, obviously. But I don't know. I don't mind having another talk with you at another time if you want to follow up.
sure, of course.
Of course, if you don't want to. As
Well, no. I'm very thankful that I got to talk to you about this, Dr. Malpass. Thank you for the thanks for the conversation. Appreciate it.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
And thank you as well. I enjoyed being able to pick your brains. You're a sporting interlocutor as well, because at least you didn't get annoyed with me. Maybe I was getting annoyed at some point. But anyway, yes. Enjoyable.
Well, yeah, no, I'm not annoyed at all. And I hope I didn't come across as like pulling the psychoanalyst move. Like if I am pulling that move, then it's just it's actually a mistake on my part, because I really don't think that I am I'm not even calling into the argument like self-deception or anything like that. Like that's not even at the forefront. I don't care about that. Like I'm just looking at the exchange. So
well, okay. So I guess if I was to really patronizingly set you some homework, it would be to try and frame Paul's argument in such a way that it doesn't need a psychoanalyst move.
Okay, I'll try to do that.
Yeah.
I know you've had conversations with people that are not great at the formalization, and I don't pretend to be great at the formalizations, but I'll give it my best shot. So yeah, thanks. I appreciate the conversation. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, I really need to go. So yes, let's wrap this up here. I'll stop the broadcast.